The morning mist clung to the valley like a ghostly blanket when Thomas first saw her. He had been checking his fence line along the creek when movement caught his eye. There, crouched behind a fallen cottonwood, was a young Lakota woman. Her dark hair was braided with beads that caught what little sunlight filtered through the fog, and her buckskin dress was torn and muddy. Thomas stopped his horse and dismounted slowly, not wanting to startle her. He was a tall man with weathered hands and kind eyes, someone who had learned to read the land and its people during his 15 years homesteading in Dakota territory. The woman looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and desperate hope. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, and Thomas could see exhaustion in every line of her body. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear, each word chosen with precision born of necessity. "Please," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the hills behind her. "Can I stay until the bandits move on?" Thomas followed her gaze and saw nothing but empty prairie, but something in her voice told him the danger was real. He nodded once, a simple gesture that would change both their lives forever. The woman's name was, which meant eternal blossom in her language. She told Thomas her story as they walked back to his cabin, her voice growing stronger with each step away from whatever had frightened her. 3 days earlier, a group of white bandits had attacked her village while most of the men were away hunting buffalo. These weren't soldiers or settlers, but criminals who roamed the territory stealing horses and whatever else they could find. They had killed her grandfather, the village elder, when he tried to protect the women and children. "They took my cousin," said, her voice breaking slightly. "Little Winona, she is only 12 summers old." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest. He had heard stories of such raids, but hearing it firsthand from someone who had lived through it made his blood boil. Still, he kept his voice calm and steady. "How many of them were there?" he asked as they approached his cabin. 7 men on horseback. They had rifles and spoke of selling horses in the white man's town. Paused at the cabin door, suddenly uncertain. "You are not like them. Why do you help me?" Thomas looked at this young woman who had lost so much and was still thinking of others. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. The cabin was small but well built, with thick log walls and a stone fireplace. Thomas had built it with his own hands when he first came to this land, dreaming of the family he hoped to have someday. That dream had died with his wife Sarah 3 years ago, killed by fever during a harsh winter. Since then, he had lived alone with only his books and his work to keep him company. Stood uncertainly in the doorway until Thomas gestured for her to enter. The cabin was clean and organized, with shelves full of books and a kitchen area that smelled of coffee and cornbread. She had never been inside a white man's home before, and everything seemed strange and foreign. "You must be hungry," Thomas said, moving toward the kitchen. "I can make some food while you rest." "I cannot pay you," said quietly. "The bandits took everything." "I'm not asking for payment," Thomas replied, pulling out flour and eggs. "When was the last time you ate?" Couldn't remember. The past 3 days had been a blur of running and hiding, of following game trails through unfamiliar territory while trying to stay ahead of the men who might still be hunting survivors. She had eaten nothing but wild berries and creek water since fleeing her village. As Thomas cooked, examined the cabin more closely, the book surprised her most of all. She had learned to read English at the mission school before her family moved away from white settlements, but she had never seen so many books in one place. There were stories and histories, books about farming and animal care, and even a few volumes of poetry. "You read all of these?" she asked, running her finger along the spine of a leather-bound volume. "Most of them," Thomas answered from the kitchen. "Books are good company on long winter nights." The smell of bacon and eggs filled the cabin, making stomach growl loudly. She couldn't remember the last time she had smelled food cooking in a safe place. For 3 days, she had been afraid to light a fire for fear of attracting attention. When Thomas set the plate before her, she ate quickly but tried to maintain her dignity. Her grandmother had taught her that a person's manners showed their character, even in the darkest times. Still, the food was the best thing she had tasted in days. "Tell me about these bandits," Thomas said, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. "Which direction were they headed when you last saw them?" Described the men as best she could. Their leader was a tall man with a red beard and a scar across his left cheek. He rode a stolen cavalry horse and carried 2 pistols on his belt. The others were younger, cruel men who seemed to enjoy causing pain. "They spoke of selling horses at the fort," said, "but I think they lie. They are not the kind of men soldiers would trust." Thomas nodded. Fort Randall was 2 days' ride to the east, and he doubted the army would do business with obvious criminals. More likely, they planned to sell the stolen animals at one of the rough settlements that had sprung up along the railroad lines. "They might come this way," Thomas said, thinking out loud. "This creek feeds into the main river, and it's the easiest route to the railroad towns." Fear flickered in his eyes, but she sat in her chair. "I will leave if my presence brings danger to you." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You're safe here. I won't let anything happen to you." It was a promise made without thought, born of instinct and decency. Thomas had always believed that a man's worth was measured by how he treated those who couldn't protect themselves. Looking at this brave young woman who had survived so much, he knew he would keep that promise no matter what it cost him. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the vast prairie that surrounded Thomas's homestead. Somewhere out there, dangerous men rode with stolen horses and a captive child. But inside the cabin, two strangers from different worlds began to build the fragile beginning of trust. Finished her meal in silence, grateful for the food but uncertain about what would come next. She had spent her life among her own people, following the old ways while slowly adapting to the changing world around them. Now she found herself dependent on the kindness of a white man she had just met. Thomas sensed her discomfort and tried to put her at ease. "There's a loft upstairs where you can rest," he said. "The blankets are clean and you'll be comfortable there." "What about the bandits?" asked. "What if they come here looking for survivors?" "Then we'll deal with them," Thomas said simply. His rifle hung above the fireplace, and he had ammunition enough to defend his home. More importantly, he had made a promise to protect this young woman, and Thomas had never broken his word to anyone. As afternoon approached, climbed to the loft and found it exactly as Thomas had described. The space was small but cozy, with a real bed covered in warm quilts. Exhaustion overwhelmed her as soon as she lay down, and for the first time in 3 days, she felt safe enough to truly sleep. Below, Thomas went about his daily chores while keeping one eye on the horizon. He fed his animals, checked his equipment, and made sure his rifle was loaded and ready. The woman sleeping in his loft had asked for shelter until the bandits moved on, and he intended to provide exactly that. But as the sun moved across the sky, Thomas found himself thinking about more than just immediate safety. There was something about that stirred feelings he thought had died with his wife. Her courage in the face of loss, her dignity despite her circumstances, and the way she had looked at his books with genuine curiosity all spoke to a depth of character he rarely encountered. The afternoon passed quietly, with no sign of trouble on the horizon. Thomas completed his work and began preparing an evening meal, choosing ingredients that would appeal to someone raised on traditional Lakota foods. He found himself wanting to see her smile, to ease the sorrow that shadowed her dark eyes. When woke, the sun was setting behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She had slept deeper than she had in months, her body finally relaxed enough to truly rest. The smell of cooking food drifted up from below, along with the sound of Thomas moving quietly around the cabin. She climbed down from the loft to find him stirring a pot over the fire. He looked up and smiled when he saw her, a warm expression that made something flutter in her chest. "Feel better?" he asked. "Much better, thank you," smoothed her hair and tried to make herself more presentable. "You have been very kind to me." "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Thomas said, ladling stew into 2 bowls. "I mean that." They ate together as darkness fell outside, the cabin warm and bright with firelight. For the first time since the attack on her village, felt something approaching peace. This strange white man had shown her more kindness than she had expected to find anywhere in this harsh world. But even as she began to relax, both of them knew that their peaceful evening was only temporary. Somewhere in the darkness, dangerous men rode with blood on their hands and evil in their hearts. The question was not whether they would come, but when, and what would happen when they did. Dawn broke with an orange glow across the prairie, and Thomas woke to the sound of moving quietly in the kitchen below. He had given her his bed and slept on the floor near the fireplace, his rifle within easy reach. Old habits from his army days had served him well during his years alone on the frontier. When he climbed down from the loft, he found had already started coffee and was preparing what looked like some kind of flatbread. She worked with practiced efficiency, her movements graceful and sure despite being in an unfamiliar kitchen. "Good morning," Thomas said, surprised by how natural it felt to have someone else in his home. "You didn't have to cook." "I want to help," replied, not looking up from her work. "In my village, we do not take without giving something back." Thomas watched her work and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. His cabin had been quiet too long, empty of the sounds and presence of another person. Sarah had been gone for 3 years, and in that time he had grown accustomed to solitude. But having here reminded him of what he had lost and what he still craved deep in his heart. "What is that you're making?" he asked, settling into his chair at the small table. "Fry bread. My grandmother taught me when I was very young." His voice softened when she mentioned her grandmother. She said good food could heal both body and spirit. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was killed in the raid, too." The words came out flat and emotionless, but Thomas could see the pain behind her controlled expression. "She tried to hide the children in the root cellar, but they found her anyway." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest again. These weren't acts of war or even desperate survival. They were acts of cruelty committed by men who had chosen evil over decency. He had seen such men during his time as a cavalry scout, and he knew they would not stop until they were stopped. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "Your grandmother sounds like she was brave." "All our women are brave. They have to be." Turned the bread in the pan, her face illuminated by the morning light streaming through the window. "Your wife, was she brave too?" The question caught Thomas off guard. He hadn't spoken about Sarah to anyone in months. Most of his neighbors knew better than to bring up painful memories, and visitors were rare on his isolated homestead. "Very brave," he said finally. "She came out here with me when this land was even more dangerous than it is now, built this cabin with her own hands while I was away scouting for the army. She never complained, never asked to go back east where life would have been easier." "What happened to her?" "Fever took her during a bad winter. The doctor was 3 days away, and by the time I could get help, it was too late." Thomas stared into his coffee cup, remembering those terrible days. "I should have taken her somewhere safer." "You cannot know what the spirits plan for us," said gently. "My grandfather used to say that some people are meant to burn bright and quick, like prairie fire. Others burn slow and steady, like the eternal flame in the sacred lodge. Your wife was prairie fire." Thomas looked up at her, surprised by the poetry of her words and the comfort they brought. In 3 years, no one had given him a way to think about Sarah's death that didn't involve regret and self-blame. "What about you?" he asked. "Prairie fire or eternal flame?" Smiled for the first time since he had met her, and Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "I think I am still discovering which kind of fire I carry." They ate breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, and Thomas found himself telling her about his life in ways he hadn't shared with anyone. He spoke about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his decision to join the army, and his dreams of building something permanent in the Dakota Territory. Listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood more about frontier life than many people who had lived it. In return, she told him about her village, about the way her people lived and moved with the seasons, about the stories her grandfather told and the medicines her grandmother gathered. She described a world that was disappearing as white settlers claimed more of the land, but she spoke without bitterness, only with sadness for what was being lost. "Do you think your people will come looking for you?" Thomas asked as they finished eating. "Eventually, but they will search the traditional routes first, the paths our people have always used. This place is off those paths, hidden in a fold of land that most would not notice." Paused, considering her words. "It is a good place to hide, but also a good place to be found if someone knows how to look." Thomas understood what she meant. His homestead was remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but anyone tracking survivors of the raid would eventually find their way here if they were persistent enough. "We should be prepared for visitors," he said, "both the kind we want and the kind we don't." They spent the morning making preparations. Thomas checked his weapons and ammunition while examined the cabin's defenses. She pointed out that the windows offered good sight lines in 3 directions, but left a blind spot on the north side where someone could approach unseen. "We should put something there," she suggested. "Old cans with stones inside hung on string. They will rattle if someone passes through." Thomas was impressed by her tactical thinking. "You've done this before." "My village had to move often when the soldiers came. We learned to watch all directions and to prepare for trouble even when we hoped it would not come." Tested the locks on the door and shutters. "This cabin is strong, but two people cannot defend every direction at once." "We don't have to defend every direction," Thomas said, lifting his rifle from its pegs above the fireplace. "We just have to make it cost them more than they're willing to pay." They worked together to set up the warning system had suggested, stringing cans filled with pebbles around the north side of the cabin. Thomas also moved some of his tools and equipment to create obstacles that would slow anyone trying to approach from that direction. By afternoon, they had done everything they could to prepare for trouble. The cabin felt secure, and Thomas found himself oddly content despite the circumstances. Having someone to work alongside, someone who understood both the beauty and the dangers of frontier life, made him feel more complete than he had in years. They took turns watching the horizon while the other rested or worked on small tasks. Spent time examining Thomas's books, reading quietly in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the window. He watched her sometimes, nodding the way she held the books carefully and turned pages with reverence. "You love to read," he observed during one of their conversations. "Books are like doorways to other worlds," she replied, closing a volume of poetry. "At the mission school, Sister taught us that reading could take us anywhere we wanted to go, even if our bodies had to stay in one place." "What kind of places do you want to go?" Considered the question seriously. "I want to see the ocean. In the books, they describe water that goes on forever, blue as the sky and full of creatures no one has ever seen. I want to understand how the white man's cities work, with so many people living close together but still apart. And I want to learn about medicines and healing, both the old ways and the new ways." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest as he listened to her dreams. Here was a woman with the intelligence and curiosity to learn anything she set her mind to, trapped by circumstances, and a world that offered few opportunities for someone of her background. "Maybe someday you'll have the chance to see those things," he said. "Maybe," his voice carried both hope and doubt. "First, I must survive what comes next." As evening approached, they prepared another meal together, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Thomas found himself remembering how to share space with someone else, how to anticipate another person's needs and movements. Seemed to be discovering similar things, adapting to the unfamiliar rhythms of life in a settler's cabin. "Tell me about your cousin," Thomas said as they sat down to eat. "The one the bandits took." Pain flickered across his face, but she answered. "Winona is my sister's daughter. Her parents died of smallpox 2 winters ago, so she lives with our grandmother and me. She is very smart, always asking questions about everything. She wants to be a healer like our grandmother was." "What does she look like?" "Small for her age, with bright eyes and long braids that she decorates with blue beads. She has a scar on her left hand from when she fell off a horse as a child." His voice broke slightly. "She must be so frightened." Thomas reached across the table and touched her hand gently. "We'll find a way to help her." It was another promise made without thinking, but Thomas meant every word. Looking at pain over her young cousin's fate, he knew he would do whatever was necessary to reunite them. Howe asked, "There are 7 of them and they have guns." "I don't know yet, but there has to be a way." Thomas squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Good people don't just give up when evil seems stronger. We find a way." That night they took turns keeping watch again. Thomas insisted that sleep in the loft while he remained downstairs with his rifle. But sleep came fitfully for both of them, disturbed by thoughts of what might be coming and what they might have to face together. Around midnight, the cans on the north side of the cabin began to rattle softly. Thomas was instantly alert, motioning for to remain quiet as he moved to the window. Outside, he could see nothing but darkness and prairie grass moving in the wind. The rattling came again, more distinctly this time. Something was definitely moving through the obstacles they had placed there. Thomas checked his rifle and positioned himself where he could see both the front door and the north window. But instead of bandits, a lone figure emerged from the darkness. It was an elderly Lakota man, moving slowly and carefully to avoid making noise. He carried a walking stick and wore traditional clothes that marked him as a person of status within his tribe. Saw him too and gasped softly. "Grandfather Crow Feather," she whispered. Thomas lowered his rifle as opened the door to greet the old man. They spoke quickly in Lakota, their voices urgent but quiet. After a few moments, turned to Thomas. He says the bandits are camped by the big river, only half a day's ride from here. They plan to move east tomorrow, but they are watching the trails for any survivors they might have missed. She paused, translating more of the old man's words. He also says that other men are following them, good men who want to bring them to justice. Thomas invited Crow Feather into the cabin, offering him food and drink. The old man accepted gratefully, and as he ate, he told them more about what he had observed. The bandits had indeed taken several horses and at least 2 captives, including little Winona. They were being pursued by a group of Lakota warriors led by Sprother, as well as a U.S. Marshal who had been tracking the gang for weeks. Both groups were moving carefully, trying to avoid alerting the criminals to their presence. "There will be a fight soon," Crow Feather said through translation. "But the bandits chose their camp well. It will not be easy to reach them without losing many good men." As dawn approached, the 3 of them sat around the fire planning their next move. The old man would return to guide the pursuing parties to the bandits' location. Wanted to go with him to help rescue her cousin and fight alongside her brother. But Thomas had a different idea, one that might give them an advantage the criminals wouldn't expect. It was dangerous and would require perfect timing, but it might be their only chance to save Winona and bring the bandits to justice without a bloody battle that could cost many lives. "What if we could get inside their camp?" he suggested. "What if they came to us instead?" Thomas's plan was dangerous and required split-second timing, but it was their best chance to save Winona without risking a battle that could cost many lives. As he explained his idea to Crow Feather, the old man's weathered face grew thoughtful, considering every angle. "The bandits expect to find scattered survivors hiding alone," Thomas said, drawing a rough map in the dirt floor with a piece of charcoal. "They don't expect organized resistance. If we can make them believe they've found easy prey, we might be able to turn their own greed against them." The plan hinged on using his homestead as bait. Crow Feather would return to the pursuing parties with word of where the bandits were camped, but he would also carry information designed to reach the criminals themselves. Through carefully placed rumors and staged evidence, they would make it appear that a wealthy settler lived at Thomas's cabin, someone with gold and valuable supplies worth stealing. "They will come here instead of running," said, understanding the strategy. "But that puts us both in great danger." "Less danger than a direct assault on their camp," Thomas replied. "Here we control the ground, we know every approach, every hiding place, every advantage." He looked at both of them seriously. "But I won't ask either of you to risk your lives for this. The choice has to be yours." Crow Feather spoke at length in Lakota, his voice carrying the weight of years and experience. When he finished, translated his words. He says that sometimes the spider's web is stronger than the warrior's spear. The bandits think like predators, not like men. They will see what appears to be easy prey and forget to look for danger. She paused, meeting Thomas's eyes. He also says that the spirits brought us together for a purpose. We should trust that purpose. They spent the remaining hours before dawn perfecting their plan. Crow Feather would return to find the pursuing parties and guide them to positions around Thomas's homestead. The warriors and the marshal would wait hidden in the tall grass and creek beds, ready to close the trap when the bandits arrived. Meanwhile, Thomas would prepare the cabin to look like the home of a prosperous but careless settler. They arranged his few valuable items in plain sight, scattered gold coins where they could be easily seen through windows, and created the appearance of wealth without proper defenses. Most importantly, they prepared hidden positions and escape routes. Thomas cut firing slots in the log walls where they could shoot without exposing themselves. They cached weapons and ammunition in multiple locations and planned signals they could use to coordinate with the hidden warriors outside. As Crow Feather prepared to leave, he pulled aside and spoke to her quietly in their native language. When they finished talking, there were tears in her eyes, but also a new determination. "What did he say?" Thomas asked after the old man had vanished into the morning mist. "He reminded me that sometimes we must risk everything to save what matters most. And he told me that my grandfather's spirit watches over me, guiding me toward my true path." Wiped her eyes and looked at Thomas with newfound resolve. "He also said that some meetings are written in the stars long before they happen on Earth." Thomas felt heat rise in his face at her words. Over the past 2 days, he had found himself thinking about in ways that had nothing to do with simple kindness or duty. Her courage, intelligence, and inner strength had awakened feelings he thought had died with his wife. But this was neither the time nor the place for such thoughts. They spent the morning making final preparations, moving carefully and deliberately to create the perfect trap. Thomas put on his best clothes and made sure his appearance suggested prosperity rather than hardship. Hid her traditional dress and borrowed some of Sarah's old clothing, transforming herself into what might appear to be a servant or hired help. The masquerade felt strange to both of them, but it was necessary for the plan to work. The bandits had to see exactly what they expected to see, nothing that would make them suspicious or cautious. By midday, everything was ready. Thomas sat on his front porch reading a book, playing the part of a careless settler who felt perfectly safe in his isolated cabin. Worked in the kitchen, visible through the open door but appearing to pay no attention to the world outside. But beneath their casual appearances, both were coiled tight as springs, ready to explode into action at the first sign of trouble. Thomas's rifle leaned against the porch rail within easy reach, while had positioned pistols and knives in strategic locations throughout the cabin. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed with no sign of movement on the prairie, and Thomas began to wonder if their plan had failed before it started. Perhaps the bandits had decided to avoid the area entirely, or maybe Crow Feather had been unable to plant the rumors that would draw them to the homestead. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, dust appeared on the northern horizon. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he counted the approaching riders. 7 men, just as had described, riding hard toward his cabin with the confidence of predators who had spotted easy prey. "They're coming," he called quietly to, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders. She moved to her position near the kitchen window, where she could see the front yard while remaining hidden from view. Her hands shook slightly as she gripped the rifle Thomas had given her, but her voice was steady when she replied. "I see them, the one in front with the red beard, that is their leader." Thomas studied the approaching men with the trained eye of a former cavalry scout. They rode in loose formation, spread out enough to avoid presenting a single target, but close enough to support each other in a fight. Their leader carried 2 pistols on his belt and a rifle across his saddle, while the others were armed with a mixture of guns and bladed weapons. Most telling was their body language. They rode with the easy confidence of men who expected no real resistance, who saw the isolated cabin as nothing more than another opportunity for easy plunder. That overconfidence would be their downfall. The bandits slowed their approach as they neared the cabin, spreading out to surround the building. Their leader dismounted about 50 yards away and walked forward with his hands near his weapons, ready to draw at the first sign of trouble. "Hello, the cabin," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the prairie. "Name's Red Jake. My boys and me are looking for water and maybe some supplies. We can pay for what we need." Thomas stood slowly, keeping his movements casual and unthreatening. "Water's free to any traveler," he replied. "As for supplies, depends on what you need and what you're offering in trade." Red Jake smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Mighty generous of you, friend. Mind if my boys water their horses at your creek while we talk business?" "Help yourselves," Thomas said, waving toward the creek that ran past his property. "Creek never runs dry even in the driest summers." As the other bandits led their horses to the water, Red Jake moved closer to the cabin. Thomas could see him taking inventory of everything in sight, noting the gold coins visible on the table through the open door, the quality of Thomas's clothes, and the general appearance of prosperity. "Fine-looking spread you got here," Red Jake said, his eyes never stopping their careful examination. "Man must do pretty well for himself to build something like this in the middle of nowhere." "I've been blessed with good fortune," Thomas replied, playing his part perfectly. "Hard work and honest dealing have served me well." Behind him continued her work in the kitchen, occasionally moving past the doorway where she could be seen. To the bandits, she appeared to be exactly what they expected, a servant or companion who posed no threat to their plans. Red Jake's eyes fixed on her immediately. "That your woman?" "She helps around the place," Thomas said carefully, knowing that the wrong word could trigger violence before they were ready. "Keeps house and tends to the cooking." "Pretty little thing, Indian, ain't she?" Red Jake's voice carried an ugly undertone that made Thomas's jaw clench. We met some of her kind a few days back. Wasn't nearly as friendly as you folks." Thomas forced himself to remain calm despite the rage building inside him. This was the man who had ordered the attack on S village, who had killed her family and stolen her young cousin. But showing anger now would ruin everything they had worked for. "I don't have any quarrel with the local tribes," Thomas said. "We all just try to get by out here." "That's a fine attitude," Red Jake said, moving closer to the porch. "Mind if I step inside? This sun's mighty hot, and I could use some shade while we conduct our business." This was the moment Thomas had been dreading and planning for. Once Red Jake entered the cabin, the trap would be sprung, and there would be no turning back. Everything would depend on perfect timing and a healthy dose of luck. "Come on in," Thomas said, stepping aside to let the bandit leader enter his home. "I'll have the lady fix us some coffee while we talk." Red Jake's boots echoed on the wooden floor as he entered the cabin, his eyes immediately drawn to the gold coins scattered on the table. Thomas saw greed flicker across the man's face, followed quickly by calculation. The bandit was already planning how to take what he wanted. "That's quite a bit of gold you got lying around," Red Jake observed, his hand drifting closer to his pistol. "Man ought to be more careful with valuables in country like this." "Never had any trouble before," Thomas said, moving to block the doorway without appearing to do so. "Most folks around here are honest." "Most folks, sure." Red Jake picked up one of the coins and examined it closely. "But there's always a few bad apples in every barrel. Why, just the other day we came across some Injuns who tried to cause us trouble, had to teach them a lesson about manners." Thomas felt every muscle in his body tense at the casual cruelty in the man's voice. Behind Red Jake, he could see preparing to move, her hand reaching for the weapon hidden beneath her borrowed dress. "That's so," Thomas said, fighting to keep his voice level. "What kind of trouble?" "Oh, the usual. Thought they could tell white men where we could and couldn't go. Had to show them different." Red Jake grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Took a few horses and other things to pay for our inconvenience." "Other things?" "Little Injun girl, pretty little thing, might be worth something to the right buyer." Red Jake's eyes glittered with malice as he watched Thomas's reaction. "Course, if you're interested in that kind of merchandise, we might be able to work out a deal." That was the breaking point. Thomas felt something snap inside him, a cold fury that burned away all caution and restraint. This man wasn't just a criminal. He was a monster who trafficked in human misery and found pleasure in causing pain. But before Thomas could move, stepped out of the kitchen with a rifle in her hands, her face a mask of controlled rage. "Let me tell you about that little girl," she said in a voice like ice. "Her name is Winona, and she is my cousin." Red Jake's hand moved toward his pistol the instant he saw his rifle, but Thomas was already in motion. Years of frontier living had honed his reflexes to razor sharpness, and he struck like a rattlesnake, his fist connecting with the bandit's jaw before the man could draw his weapon. Red Jake stumbled backward, blood streaming from his split lip, but managed to stay on his feet. His hand finally reached his pistol, but his rifle was already trained on his chest. "Move and you die," she said simply, her finger steady on the trigger. Outside, shouts erupted as the other bandits realized something was wrong. But those shouts quickly turned to cries of alarm as hidden warriors rose from the tall grass around the creek. Crow Feather had done his job perfectly, positioning the Lakota fighters and the marshal's men in a complete circle around the homestead. The battle was brief and decisive. Caught by surprise and outnumbered, the bandits found themselves facing skilled fighters who knew the terrain and had every advantage. Within minutes, 4 of them were dead and the other 2 had surrendered, their weapons thrown down in defeat. Red Jake heard the sounds of his men's defeat and his face went pale. "You set us up," he snarled, his eyes darting between Thomas and, "This was all planned." "Yes," said calmly. "Did you think there would be no consequences for your crimes? Did you believe you could murder and steal without anyone seeking justice?" Before Red Jake could answer, the cabin door burst open and his brother strode inside, followed by a tall man wearing a marshal's badge. The family resemblance between the siblings was unmistakable, though her brother's face was painted for war and his eyes burned with barely controlled fury. The two exchanged rapid words in Lakota, and Thomas saw relief flood's features as her brother confirmed what she desperately needed to hear. "Winona is alive," she translated for Thomas. They found her hidden in the bandits' camp. She is frightened but unharmed. Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The plan had worked, justice would be served, and an innocent child would be returned to her family. Marshal Carson, a weathered man with kind eyes and a steel backbone, stepped forward to take Red Jake into custody. "Jake, you're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, horse theft, and about a dozen other crimes. You and your surviving men will be transported to Fort Randolph for trial." Red Jake's bravado crumbled as the marshal's handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "You can't let them savages testify against white men in court." "These savages just helped me capture criminals who've been terrorizing this territory for months," Marshal Carson replied coldly. "And in case you haven't noticed, times are changing. Justice doesn't depend on the color of a person's skin anymore." As the marshal led Red Jake outside, turned to Thomas with tears streaming down her face. Without thinking, she stepped into his arms, and he held her close as she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what they had accomplished. "It's over," Thomas murmured into her hair. "Your family is safe." "Because of you," she whispered back, "because you kept your promise." They were interrupted by the arrival of little Winona, carried in the arms of one of the Lakota warriors. The 12-year-old girl was thin and dirty, clearly traumatized by her ordeal, but her eyes lit up when she saw. The reunion was everything Thomas had hoped it would be. Winona flew into her cousin's arms, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. The warriors gathered around them, relieved smiles replacing their war paint as they celebrated the rescue of their youngest member. But as the immediate joy of reunion faded, Thomas found himself facing an uncomfortable reality. People had come to take her home. She would return to what remained of her village, and he would go back to his solitary life on the prairie. The thought left him feeling emptier than he had since Sarah's death. Seemed to sense his thoughts. After ensuring that Winona was comfortable and fed, she sought him out as he stood alone on his front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You are sad," she observed, settling beside him on the wooden step. "Not sad exactly," Thomas said, struggling to find the right words. "Just thinking about what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that neither had dared to speak aloud. Thomas looked at this remarkable woman who had changed his life in just a few short days, and he found the courage to speak his heart. "I want you to stay," he said simply. "I know it's selfish, and I know you have obligations to your people, but these past days have been the happiest I've known since Sarah died. You make this place feel like a home again instead of just a house." Was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. "My brother says I can choose my own path," she said finally. "The old ways are changing, and some of our people are learning to live in the white man's world. He says I could be a bridge between our peoples, helping others learn to survive in this new time." "What do you want?" "I want to see the ocean someday," she said, smiling at him. "I want to read every book in your library and then find more books to read. I want to learn about medicine and healing, and I want to build something lasting with someone who sees the world the way I do." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I am saying that perhaps the spirits did bring us together for a reason. Perhaps this cabin is meant to be my home too, if you would have me." Thomas took her hand in his, marveling at how perfectly it fit. "I would be honored to have you stay, but what about your family, your people?" "They will always be my family, and I will visit them often. But Winona has many cousins to care for her, and my brother is marrying a good woman who will be like a mother to her." Squeezed his hand gently. "Besides, Crowfeather reminded me that sometimes the best way to honor our ancestors is to help build a better future for our children." They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness fell around them, each lost in thoughts of what their future might hold. Inside the cabin, Winona slept peacefully for the first time in days, while outside, her rescuers prepared for the journey back to their village. Marshal Carson approached the porch, his business with the prisoners concluded. Mister, I want to thank you both for your help in capturing these criminals. Your plan was risky, but it saved lives and brought justice for the victims." "What will happen to them?" Thomas asked. "And his surviving men will stand trial at Fort Randolph. With the evidence we have and the testimony of the survivors, they'll face either long prison sentences or hanging." The marshal's expression was grim but satisfied. Either way, they won't be hurting anyone else. As the marshal prepared to leave, his brother approached for a final conversation with his sister. They spoke at length in Lakota, their voices carrying the weight of important decisions and permanent farewells. When they finished, he turned to Thomas and spoke in careful English. "You saved my sister's life and helped rescue our child. Our families are bound by debt that can never be repaid." "No debt," Thomas replied, remembering phrases had taught him. "We are all people under the same sky." His brother smiled at the words, recognizing the traditional Lakota blessing. "You speak truth. Perhaps the sky grows larger when different peoples learn to live beneath it together." The next morning brought a flurry of activity as the Lakota warriors prepared to return home with little Winona. The child had recovered remarkably quickly from her ordeal, her natural resilience shining through despite everything she had endured. She spent her final hours at the cabin helping with small tasks, chattering constantly in a mixture of Lakota and English. Thomas found himself charmed by her bright spirit and quick intelligence, understanding why loved her so deeply. "Will you visit us?" Winona asked as her escort prepared to leave. "Will you bring Thomas to see our new village?" "Yes," promised, hugging the girl tightly. "We will come to see you often, and when you are older you can come stay with us and learn to read all of Thomas's books." Winona's eyes lit up at the prospect. "All of them?" "Every single one," Thomas confirmed, smiling at her enthusiasm. "And we'll find more books for you to read too." The farewells were emotional but not final. This was not an ending but a transformation, the creation of new bonds that would connect two families across cultural lines. As the group rode away toward the horizon, Thomas and stood together watching until they disappeared into the morning haze. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked as they turned back toward the cabin. "Only that it took bandits and danger to bring us together," replied, slipping her hand into his. "I wish we could have met under better circumstances." "Maybe we did meet under the right circumstances," Thomas suggested. "Maybe we both needed to go through hard times to appreciate what we have now." They spent that day and the ones that followed settling into their new life together. Moved her few possessions from the loft to the bedroom she would now share with Thomas, while he made space for her belongings and adjusted to having a permanent companion. The changes went deeper than mere logistics. Thomas found himself remembering how to share decisions and space, how to consider another person's needs and preferences in everything he did. Discovered the rhythms of settled life, learning to think in terms of seasons and years rather than the constant movement that had defined her childhood. They complemented each other perfectly. Thomas's practical skills and frontier experience blended seamlessly with traditional knowledge and intuitive understanding of the natural world. Together, they created something neither could have achieved alone. As autumn approached, they began making plans for the future. Thomas would expand his farming operation while started a garden using traditional methods her grandmother had taught her. They talked about building additions to the cabin, maybe even starting a school for children from both cultures. "I want to write down my grandmother's stories," said one evening as they sat by the fire. "All the old tales and the medicine knowledge she taught me. If I don't preserve them, they might be lost forever." "We could send them to publishers back east," Thomas suggested. "Let other people learn from your grandmother's wisdom." The idea excited them both, and they began planning how to document and share the traditional knowledge that might otherwise disappear as the old ways gave way to new realities. On their wedding day 6 months later, representatives from both cultures gathered to witness their union. Marshal Carson served as best man, while Winona, now fully recovered and radiant with happiness, scattered flower petals before the bride. Crowfeather performed the traditional Lakota ceremonies while the circuit preacher handled the Christian service. It was a celebration that bridged worlds, bringing together people who might have been enemies under different circumstances. Settlers and warriors sat side by side, sharing food and stories as the autumn sun blessed their gathering. As Thomas and exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever challenges might come, they both understood that they were creating something new and precious. Their marriage represented hope for a future where different peoples could find common ground and mutual respect. Years passed, and their homestead became known throughout the territory as a place where travelers of all backgrounds could find hospitality and fair dealing. They raised children who spoke both languages and understood both cultures, young people who would grow up to be bridges between worlds their parents had once seen as separate. Thomas kept his promise to show the ocean, taking her east to see the Atlantic waters she had dreamed about since childhood. She kept her promise to preserve her grandmother's stories, publishing them in books that would be read and treasured by generations of children from many different backgrounds. But perhaps most importantly, they kept the promise they had made to each other in those desperate days when bandits threatened everything they held dear. They created a love that transcended cultural boundaries and a home that welcomed all who came in peace. The cabin still stands today, weathered by countless seasons but sturdy as ever. Local legends say that on quiet prairie evenings, you can still hear the echo of laughter and the soft murmur of voices speaking words of love in two languages, proof that some bonds are strong enough to bridge any divide and endure beyond the span of mortal years.